Michael, who's a luthier, that is another word for a guitar maker, here in Canberra, and Tom from Konig Bassworks, who's also a maker that specialises in bass instruments, electric basses. In my case, I first got involved with guitars back in the 1960s when I was about 15 years old, and I've been more or less playing and enjoying instruments of the guitar family ever since. And when I was a teenager, I think I was 17 going on 18, I went to America for a year as an exchange student and saw some amazing music, some great bands in California and blues music in Chicago, near where I was living for that year. And that just really cemented my interest in music, and especially blues and contemporary, what we call Americana now, sort of music, acoustic and electric music of America, as it was being expressed in Australia too, because the 70s was a pretty active time for bands and music. And I got involved with playing in bands in Adelaide for many years, and also in Canberra. So some of those stories will come out when I talk about a couple of instruments, and then what we'll do is have a bit of a question and answer if you've got any queries as we go along. So I guess I'll start, and then I'll introduce Michael and Tom, and we'll sort of get them talking about their journey too. So what I've done today is to bring along two instruments. Both of these are Australian made, but they represent two ends of a 50-year journey. So this is I'm saying 1934, 1935, we don't know for sure, but it was the period when these were being made. Tex Morton guitar, and we'll talk about Tex in a minute. And this one is from 1984, and it's made by a gentleman called Brian De Grucci, who became quite well known around Australia for his acoustic guitars. And they're sort of, to me, as far as what we've got in the big room today of all the guitars that are there, which I'm connected with, these kind of represent, on the acoustic side, a sort of journey of 50 years in Australian music. And the reason why I find that so fascinating is that the world that this was made in helped form what this guitar is. We'll talk about the fact that radio was basically one of the only main ways, apart from being in a room with an instrument, that you could actually hear a guitar back in 1934. And then by the 1980s, we're still ahead of, we've certainly had TV, and we had the beginnings of modern technology. CDs, I think, had come out, but certainly not the sort of current, digital age where everything is connected to everything else. So, and the stories behind these two guitars are quite different. So I'll do that quickly, and then we'll introduce Michael and Tom and have a discussion. So the fascinating stories with Tex Morton is that in Australia, in the pre-war period, the first music that people were really listening to in a popular sense was Hawaiian music. It was a huge craze around the world, coincided with radio spreading around into the Western world. But in the late 20s, 30s, movies from America were very focused on cowboys, and country music had started to take off what was really called hillbilly music in the early days, and it took off in Australia too. And the biggest star of the day, who sold more records than any other performer from anywhere around the world, apparently, in Australia, was Tex Morton. And he was a 15-year-old New Zealand guy that ran away from home, came to Australia, and kind of had learnt a bit of guitar from a Maori family near his home, and he reinvented himself as a singing cowboy and started to do radio performances and gigs, and wound up as this big star up and down the east coast of Australia, touring a Wild West show with trick pony riders and whip cracking and sharpshooting, people who could shoot cigarettes out of the mouth of somebody else and all this kind of stuff. It was carnival stuff, really. And one of the things he did was he had a Gibson L00 guitar, and it's quite a nice guitar for that era, and I guess as soon as he made some money from his appearances, he bought it. He was clever enough to realise that there was a bit of a demand for guitars. So he arranged with a guy called Harry West in Melbourne, who had a small workshop down there already making guitars, to make a range of Tex Morton guitars. And there's actually two of them in the big room. This is one I happen to have, and Owen Ray over in the corner of the big room, who's got a Tex Morton guitar as well. And the story which I got right from the horse's mouth in about 2004, I was in a a band here in Canberra, Queen Juanita and the Zydeco Cowboys, and we did a gig at a country music festival. And when I was kind of walking around the area where the music was, I saw this guy who was about shorter than me, so, you know, about 5 foot tall, in full cowboy regalia, you know, hat, bright shirt, you know, embroidered jacket, boots, walking along with a guitar in a tiger skin sort of pattern case. And I thought, I've got to talk to this guy. And it turns out his name was Buck Carson, and that's what he called himself, but I'm sure it was a stage name. And I followed him, and he walked to a bus. He was travelling in a bus, and in the bus he was living in there, or camping in it. And at the front of the bus he had a whole lot of Tex Morton memorabilia, including a couple of these guitars. So naturally I started talking to him, and the story came out. And I was saying, you know, gee, did Tex Morton actually play one of these? Because they're made out of plywood. They're a very, you know, cheap sort of guitar construction, the absolute opposite of what the other ones that we've got on the stage here. And he said, oh, no. As soon as he could afford one, Tex bought a Gibson 00, which is a guitar that looks similar to this, but it's a completely different guitar. And he said he had Harry West spray it white and put the decals on it, so it looked like a Tex Morton guitar, and that's what he was playing in these tent shows and these kind of these halls and country fairs and things that he travelled to. And then he would spruik them and say, right, you know, you can sound like Tex Morton, just send 14 shillings and sixpence to this PO address in Melbourne, and in the mail you'll receive one of these and all the instructions you know you need to learn how to play like Tex Morton. And he sold hundreds of them around Australia. They still turn up, especially in country towns. And they're kind of playable, but they're not fantastic, you know. And certainly I did a bit of research, and the other day, in 14 shillings and sixpence in 1940 or 39 equates to close to $1,000 these days. So it was a lot of money to send away for a guitar which was kind of playable but not great. But anyway, the style of, I won't talk too much longer, but that's the history of Tex Morton and his guitars, and I'll pass around a bit of stuff I've got about him there. The sort of music he played was very much based, we were talking to Skip Sale, who's in the room, has huge knowledge of pre-war music, and he was saying that really Tex would have heard some of the very early performers, and they had this kind of strong thumb style of that kind of thing. And a lot of the country songs were sentimental sort of ballads. That kind of thing, just C, F and G for the... It gets harder to play as you go up the neck and so on. And then you get these typewritten sheets from him that would explain how to play the chords and things. So that's a 1934-35 Tex Morton guitar. I might actually pass it round, you guys can have a look at it. It's a tough little bugger, it won't have any damage. Thanks. What I'll do is I'll talk about the DeGrucci later on, but I'd really like to introduce my colleagues now. So on my left is Michael Hargreaves, who's a guitar maker, luthier here in Canberra. And Mike, would you like to talk a little bit about your guitar journey and your making?
Yeah, of course. Thank you for listening. I got hooked on guitar because of this guy, Brian May, as a teenager. Like him, I could not afford a Fender Strat or anything like that when I was young, and my dad was a very pragmatic woodworker and an excellent metal worker, and we spent most of our childhood in the shed. So I have literally been doing woodwork since I was a child. When I was about 16, I sort of nervously approached him and said I'd like to learn how to play the bass, and he kind of said, well, who plays the bass? Don't you want to play guitar? And sorry, Tom.
I'm not a player.
And so the next day we went down to the second-hand shop and bought the cheapest piece of junk on the shelf, and it was awful. And we spent a lot of time just fixing cracks and making it.
It was a bass?
No, it was a six-string.
Yeah.
He talked me out of the bass. Yeah. And I think he was kind of reliving his childhood. He wanted to learn an instrument, but didn't have the opportunity. But so I got into the classic rock style at the time. So Queen, Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, the usual suspects. But growing up in country Western Australia, I was probably the only person in the whole region who was also interested in jazz and Django Reinhardt. So I came from another avenue and copped a fair bit of ribbing for my love of gypsy jazz at the time as well. But yeah, back to the story. I couldn't afford a guitar, so I went down to Bunnings, bought a whole bunch of Jarrah, and made the world's heaviest Red Special rip-off, which was kind of half Red Special, half Steve Vai Gem at the time. I still have it. I don't show anybody it. But I did use it in a band for about 10 years, so I actually got a lot of use out of it, and it sounded all right. It was okay. But I got hooked, you know. One guitar turned into two, turned into three. Before you know it, you want to get better, you want to learn how to do different techniques. Unlike my dad, I also learned how to sharpen tools. It just kind of it evolved from there. And from the mid-90s, I was building a few guitars here and there in the back shed. They were all electric. And then I started doing it for other people. And then one thing led to another, and I took a severe detour, and I got in touch with a guy over in Perth who is called Chris Brady, and I don't know if anyone's into drums, but Chris Brady is a legend in the drum industry, and he was making custom-made Jarrah block snares for Jeff Porcaro, Chad Smith, a lot of the top US players, Neil Peart, he made one for Buddy Rich. And then I worked in the factory for about a year with him making block snares, and we were making them for U2, Pearl Jam, who else was there? Red Hot Chili Peppers, those guys. It was the Dream Factory. It literally was the Dream Factory, but we made next to no money, and the place was a perennial fire hazard. I don't think they knew what a broom was, but that spurred my interest a lot. And Chris was amazing to me. He lent the factory to me on weekends to build guitars, and coached me through not so much the business side of it, but talking about things like efficiency and how to sort of get the most out of what little you've got. He didn't have a lot. But he managed to get 30 snare drums out a month, and sell every single one of them. Most of them were overseas. I couldn't afford to put petrol in my car to get to his factory, so I had to give it up. And then I moved over to Sydney, and I worked in the events industry in Sydney for a while and had to put the tools away. And then when I eventually moved to Canberra, I picked the tools up again and started doing repairs exclusively. And that's pretty much where I'm at the moment. My primary work now is repairs and restorations. I do make the occasional guitar, and the first big project I undertook was to actually make a proper Red Special, which is this one. Yeah. This is 12 years old, and it's mine oh mine, but a few people cottoned on to what I was doing, and I managed to make three, and two of them were for commission. So that turned out to be a really good project. But at the time, there was no information about it. We were part of an international forum that was kind of gathering information from around the world to figure out what the dimensions were, how it was made.
Maybe just for people who don't know, just mention what it's modelled on.
Yeah, so basically, Brian's he was a budding astrophysicist. His dad was a Concorde engineer. They were looking at trying to make a guitar that had zero friction, so you could drop the trem bar and it would go back to zero, and it would never be out of tune. So they experimented a lot with how to do the tremolo, different sorts of switching, low angles everywhere, so that there was literally no friction on any section of the guitar whatsoever.
This is Brian May from Queen.
The other thing he wanted to do was he wanted to be able to control feedback, so the whole guitar is actually hollow. And he says he tuned it. I don't know about that because he was playing it through a radio in the living room, so I don't know how much he actually tuned it. But yeah, it controls feedback really well. It doesn't squeal, so he modified the Burns Trisonics pickups that he's got in it to be less microphonic. So they're they're all encased in araldite. I got these ones made by a guy called Adrian Addison, who makes Brian's backup pickups, and I managed to get hold of him, and he made me 3 sets. And I don't think he does it much anymore, but he also owns the original Burns pickup winders, and so he was very encouraging.
So for people, I'm sure probably everyone in the room knows, but just in case, these silver goodies here are the pickups. They're basically magnets wrapped with many, many, many strands of very thin wire, which translate the vibration of the steel string into an electrical signal.
Yep. I did most of the metal work myself, but I don't do metal work. It was a labour of love, and it was only a one-off for this one. But I tried to build the bridge here, but it got too complicated, and it's got very, very tiny rollers on it. And eventually, I got one of the guys on the forum lives in Peru, and he had a metal mill, and he made all the little tiny rollers for me, and he made the bridge. I had the knobs made as well to match Brian's. But everything else I did in our apartment at the time, not because I didn't have a shed. I actually I converted the second bedroom of our 5th story apartment into a workshop, and had a very active vacuum cleaner, and did most of the milling and most of the finished work in the apartment. When we moved to our own house, I've set up the front garage as my new workshop, and over the last few years I've been building it up to be doing repairs and building flamencos and nylon strings and exclusively acoustic guitars, which I think is sort of where my love is. But that's transcended now into violins, cellos and double basses, and most of my work now is repairing and restoring and setting up violins and cellos. So it started off being a rock pig, and now I'm just a classical buff. So, and I love flamenco as well. So they're my 2 major loves now, and flamenco guitars are just wonderful. They've got beautiful, snappy response and no sustain whatsoever. You can get a really good, sharp, danceable sound out of it. So when people move, I feel happy. So. Yeah, but that's my personal story.
Beautiful instrument.
Yeah. I don't own any of the other guitars that I've built, and I don't have access to them, so I'm sorry I couldn't bring any along, but it's nice to be able to hand them over and never see them again. So, yeah.
That's good. Should we hear a little bit of this one, and then we'll talk to Tom about his bass journey?
Yep.
So, and just to mention, because we're Australian made here this afternoon, the little amp down here is one of our favourite amps that we, Simon and I in Capital Vintage Guitars have got access to, a handmade by Mark Watson up in the Gold Coast, an exact replica with very high quality components of the very first amps that Leo Fender made in the late 1940s, which were called Woodies because they had a wooden cabinet.
And I'm also sorry, we're talking about Australian guitars, and I have a quintessentially British guitar in my hands.
Australian.
performer. There is a lot of switching on this thing, so you can go through different...
That's a nice jazzy tone right there. You just take some of the treble out of the mix, and it's incredibly quiet. The amp is too, you know.
Yeah.
And when I say quiet, the background noise is minimal. And that sort of growling, sort of slightly edgy sound, the overdrive that lots of guitar players seek, especially when they're playing solos or lead guitar. The valve amps will do that when you just turn the volume up, and that's why these, although the technology dates back to the age of radio and the 34 Tex Morton, they're still very most popular sort of amp that people like to have.
Yeah, and they're very responsive as well. So you can a lot of the volume is controlled by your fingers. Yes. So if you've got the valve amps, you can brush lightly and get a really delicate sound, or you can. Really do that on the solid state amps and the new moderns, because they tend to have just this flat dynamic, and if you want it to be louder, you've got to turn it up louder, whereas the valves just respond to whatever you want to do. I knew you were going to ask a question.
Oh please, yeah, we'll ask a question.
I'm not here as a plant, I'm just I'm intrigued by the pickups. Are they they're switchable to out of phase as well?
Yep, so the way these are set up, the top three switches are on-off switches for each one. I don't know if anyone's into electronics, but it's wired in series instead of parallel, which means that the more pickups you switch on, the output signal sums. So you get like a 3 dB increase in every single output the more you have on. The bottom three pickups are phase switches, so that you can switch the polarity of the coils. So, say if I've got these two on in phase, if I switch one out of phase, you can hear it buzz, because when it was in phase, it was actually humbucking. Now that it's out of phase, you've got the buzz, and you've also lost a lot of your bass and your lower end tone. So. Normally I have them in, I just have 2 pickups in phase, or 3 pickups in phase, just so that there's a bit of a humbucker effect on it, because they can get noisy. And with the series wiring, it is a lot louder than a Fender Strat or a Telecaster. So but when I also say louder, it's also noisier. I'm amazed at the amp, actually. It's a wonderfully quiet amp, but if you've got this through an old Vox AC30, you've got a lot of hiss and a lot of noise going along with it, which can detract from the sound. But it's actually part of the Queen sound, if that makes any sense. And a lot of the things that are wrong with the guitar, and there's not much that's wrong with it, actually are part of the sound. So, the low action, you've got a lot of rattle on the strings, and you can hear that in the song.
And the zero fret, I noticed.
And the zero fret, which I have to admit, I've never had one before, but I absolutely love it.
So maybe just quickly explain that, and then we'll have...
Yeah, so normally a guitar will just have the nut here, and then you'll have the frets starting at number 1. This one's actually got what's called a zero fret, so you've actually got the strings sitting over a fret at where the nut position would traditionally be, and then you've got a nut behind it, which all it does is guides the string into a straight line, so that if you bend a note, the string doesn't just bend up here as well. So it's literally just anchoring the string into a position. That means you can get an exceptionally low action high up here, and you do get a little bit of rattle sometimes. But with this one, I've actually made the zero fret just slightly higher than all the others, so it just sits marginally higher. Yeah. But,
thanks, Michael. I'm conscious of Tom sitting to my right, and we'll move across.
A lot of similarities,
yes.
and that's Where do I start? There are. Sorry.
That's okay.
Do I have to speak into this?
Oh.
Okay. Had I known Mike was around, as with a lot of the other people I've met this weekend, this is the first time I've ever been at a show or something like this. I consider myself a bit of a hermit in the music industry. I've been around for a very, very long time. For me, it's more of a confidence thing. If I look at what all the other guys are doing, I think I'm doing something wrong. It's so yeah. Plus, in all the years I've been around, I've found the business overall can be very frustrating, and there's a lot of smoke and mirrors. And certainly when I was a kid, I ran into a lot of brick walls with the so-called builders that were around, and there simply weren't that many around in those days. And my journey was, well, I hate that word journey, it's just so cliche. I don't actually consider myself a builder or luthier, or I get embarrassed when people call me a luthier. Well, and the reason I say that is because for me, I talked to Mike about this, a luthier is, you go off into the Black Forest in Germany somewhere, and you disappear for 10 years and you come out after your apprenticeship, and then you actually do know what you're doing. I actually came dangerously close to doing that, but I decided I wanted to be an electrician, which, anyway. So to sum it up, I actually consider myself a model aeroplane guy first. I'm a mad model aeroplane guy, and that's where I actually think I owe a lot of my skill that I developed as a kid. And I've played with model aeroplanes as far back as I can, my earliest memories. So anyway,
can I interject?
Yeah.
I concur. I did the same, and violin making is a direct descendant of model aeroplane making, or vice versa. The skills are so
similarities.
similar.
Yeah, and I think that's where, as a child, I basically learned, and I learned that through training thousands of apprentices over the years. Not thousands, hundreds. You do, as a child, develop some manual skills simply through doing stuff. And I'm a terrible father because I didn't actually teach my own kids. They didn't have the interest. I actually have rock stars coming to the house, and they're not interested in music. They're not interested in building. They're just off in their own world gaming, and that's what they do. Mind you, they're off now and they're gone, but they're successful in their own right. But anyway, for me, back to the thing. I was doing my model aeroplanes. I had a stepbrother at the time, who was 5 years older than me, and he was a teenager. And he said, "Well, you're designing." And I was designing my own aeroplanes and building. Can you build me a guitar? Easy, doesn't have to fly. But in the 70s, yes, some guitars did fly. And that one, I don't know whatever became of it. I lost my stepbrother many decades ago.
Sorry, Tom, was it acoustic or electric?
It was electric. The only bloke that I knew that was building acoustic was it Jim Williams?
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. But I ran into brick walls there. But anyway, so I built this electric guitar, and it worked, and it was pretty ordinary, but it looked okay. So whenever people ask me about instruments, and I have a very open opinion about anything, I don't think anything's bad or wrong or right, or it's all just different. This guitar was pretty woeful thinking back. But then by the time I got to be, I was 13, 14, and I started, I don't know what caught me with basses. To me, they look more right than a guitar. Sorry. Guitars just look too short. I don't know, there was something, and plus also I just wanted to be a little bit different. Anyway, so I got into, I built my first bass, and it was fretless because I decided that putting frets in was too hard on that guitar. And back then you had to mail order everything. You couldn't get anything. Even, you know, you'd make a phone call to Sydney, you hang on, that was long distance, STD phone call, you go, and, oh, hurry up because it costs money, you know. So it was a different world, but I bashed my way through it. And then as a teenager, it suddenly started getting cool. And thinking back, everybody at school thought, this is what this guy's going to do. And then somehow, at the end of year 12, I saw, hang on, apprenticeship, I can get an apprenticeship, I can move out, I can get out of here, I can do my, you know. So, anyway, so I did continue building right into sort of, I think I was about 22. But when you're young and moving around from group houses and, you know, you're looking for a group house that you had to move your ordinary machinery and this and that, and I remember one house I tried to move my machinery in the garage. I thought, hang on, this false wall here, and I went under the house, there was all these plants growing. Whoa. Anyway, I was actually replacing the guy that had the plants, so oh, okay. Anyway, yeah, dodged that bullet. So then there was a few years where I didn't build, and then I did start again in the 90s. But yeah, I was busy with my career and studying and everything else and so on. But I was building, and I did keep to myself. And even now, I got dragged here kicking and screaming, didn't I? But I'm very glad I did. I've met some wonderful people, and maybe I should have done this, 20, 30 years ago. As far as building goes, I'll get onto that now. With a lot of my woods, not a lot, I still have some woods that I've got left over from the 80s. And that's literally, I've always hoarded my Brazilian rosewood. I do have some big slabs. I've got 2 big slabs of it left, and some fingerboards and so on. I've dragged that around probably to 5 or 6 group houses, I remember as a young fella. And I'm glad I did, because the stuff's irreplaceable now. Unless you live in America, the Americans can have anything they want and use anything they want, but you can't get it into the country here unless you go through a million bits of paperwork, and it's just financially just not worth it. I've got a lot of wood that I collected over the years, and I don't even, as far as my wife's concerned, she doesn't know, and I don't even know how much I've spent on it. Some of it is extremely collectible, rare, and it simply, when it became available, I bought it. So I've got a good stash of wood, and some of it's been sitting there for a long, long time. I've also got, as everyone does, a fair share of rubbish, but it gets used up gradually for jigs and things and whatever else I want to do.
Tom, can I interrupt and just ask if when you're building your basses, which are very, each one is quite unique, it seems to me. Sorry, each instrument is quite unique. Does a potential client say, talk to me about the woods that you've got available? Because that's something that's common to all these instruments, is that wood is a singular feature of the instrument.
It's a commodity almost. It's done my head in seeing all the guys with the Australian timbers on the acoustics. I find the opposite, that nobody asks for Australian timbers. There are in the bass world. It's part of the conditioning that we're used to. Even here, you think about it here. You've got your older maple, rosewoods. That's your swamp ashes, and that's what everybody's used to in the Gibson and Fender world. Acoustics, yes, you've got a those guys experiment with what they can get, and there are some exceptional Australian timbers. But in the bass world and some of the stuff, it's just, I'd like to experiment a bit more, but I haven't got the time. I've only got so many more basses in me before I'm dead and buried, so I'd love to, but I just can't. And that's part of my own lack of business approach to certain things is my process. I don't really have a process, and I've got the luxury of doing whatever the hell I want at the moment, but I've got too many orders at the moment to really take that attitude. So I've got to be careful with what I do, and I've got to spend my time more wisely. So with the building,
maybe talk about the space and how that relates.
Well, this one's a bit of a different one.
Oh, okay.
But generally, what I do now is, which we've known against each other, is I do make all my own hardware. These days I make my own pickups, I make my own bridges, I do my own gold plating, nickel plating, not on this bass, not this one. But those of you that have seen the crazy 15 string and the 12 string that I do, that sort of is the area that I'm heading towards. There's a few Americans that are falling over themselves for that sort of stuff. And funnily, yesterday, some guitarists as well. And then I thought I'd get the pitchforks that come after me for bringing something like that. But yes, I do. I'm not a fitter and machinist. My dad actually was a tool maker back in the before he was an engineer, and so I do have a CNC mill and a CNC router. I'm not as adept as with the 3D CAD as what some people are and so on, and I use my CNC machines as a combination. I can actually build something faster by hand than using CNC, but I use the machines for where I can do it where it makes sense and work smarter, not harder sometimes. But yeah, some of the complex 3D stuff, and it's not a question of I'll put a block of wood on the machine and walk away, and 15 hours later there's a guitar. It doesn't work like that. Setup time and the complex 3D drawings that you have to do, I just can't do it. I'm not that good at it, and I use it as a combination approach. But certainly for building hardware, the metal work, again, I don't have a 5-axis mill, it's only a 3-axis, so there's certain stuff I can do, there's certain stuff I won't do. I wish I had the time to learn it, but I haven't got the energy because I've got model aeroplanes to build as well. So, and I used to do that competitively, flying on that side, so that used to take up an enormous amount of time. So yes, these days I really do enjoy, maybe I'm stupid and pig-headed, but I like being able to do everything, and that's the only thing I haven't made yet is the machine heads, but strings and machine heads I don't make, but my strings these days I've got contact for those crazy 15s and so on. I get them made by a guy in the UK. No, it's not Roto Sound, it's actually Newtone in Silverman. He makes strings to whatever I want, so I've been using them, and some people like them, some people don't. And as far as tone woods goes, I find that is a really hot topic. I just call it wood. Tone wood? Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, some things sound better, and overall combinations with guitars. Yes, it's like cooking, I call the older rock maple, that's the spag bowl of guitars, It's what everybody will eat. You know, it's kid friendly. You know, but there's certain combinations and it definitely works. You know, and that's what we're all conditioned to hear. There are some more interesting combinations you can try, but with varying results. You know, I'm not saying it's bad, just different. But it is difficult. You can get the best ingredients for cooking a meal, and you can still burn it at the end. You know, and I've cooked a few bases for sure that I got wrong, but thankfully the owners love it. I actually can't stand this one. I don't like it. I like the colour; it looks alright. Yeah, this one has actually got a Brazilian rosewood fingerboard, and it's the usual combination: older body, flame, maple neck, Brazilian rosewood. Got LEDs on the side. Switch them on and off. Again, with that being a removable neck, quite simple really. Just got contact points in there. Spring-loaded contacts. You can just unbolt the neck. No wires going to do. It just comes off. A couple of contacts there. Simple. Very useful on stage. So, as far as every other build goes, everything's possible. It just depends on how much effort you want to put in. And as Mike knows, you put ridiculous amount of hours into some things, you know. Even on a really expensive build, I always joke, I'll build you a $10,000 base. Yeah, it'll probably cost me about 35, you know. So, but there is the business side of it. Repairs, I can't stand them. Yeah, but it is the bread and butter. But it is something repairs and setup are just shoot me now. But it's amazing how many really capable musicians play really badly set up instruments or fundamental engineering on the instruments, and that's how I approach it, because I don't consider myself a player and I can't play compared to all the people that come through my door. You know, they are some really seriously talented musicians, and it's amazing what rubbish they'll put up with. Then you actually fix the engineering, and that there is no black art on instruments. It is purely physics and engineering. That's all it is. There's no black, you know. There's no smoke and mirrors, and I actually feel quite strongly about the so-called artist luthiers that promote that BS, basically. Because at the end of the day, it's a string that moves around some frets, and it's all measurable, and that's where my instrumentation, as in industrial instrumentation, comes in. It's measurement of stuff. You know, if you have all the right equipment, you could measure exactly. You could see, you know, you have some high-speed cameras, you can see whether the neck's moving or this or that, what's bouncing around, and you know, it is just purely physics. But it's amazing how many musos will put up with, you know, unlevel fretboards that are the cause of the frets being in the, you know, high. And, it's actually not the fret being high. The root cause is your fretboard. Wasn't like that from the factory, and actually 90% of, you shouldn't even really have to do a fret dress. Rip them all out and get the fretboard right for a start. Then get the frets in right. Oh, look, I don't need a fret dress because they're all in properly and they're all level to start with. But you've got to understand that everything is made to a price.
I think I might just jump in there and say that for any one of us who've got instruments, that just leaving aside whether it's an electric guitar, an acoustic guitar or a bass, that the setup is really fundamental.
It is.
And experienced musicians eventually evolve a feel and a oral sense of what they're looking for, and it's really good to explore that for yourself as a player, and make sure that you understand that side of your enjoyment of the musical instrument, because as Tom was saying, there's a science behind getting an instrument to play accurately in a musical sense, to play smoothly in a physical sense. And to feel right in a sort of emotional sense. I think it's I don't know if emotional is quite the right word, but I was talking to Les Karski earlier today, and he always plays Stratocasters. Well, that's great, but for him, he said it just feels like I'm not holding anything. It's because I'm so used to it. It feels like a part of my body, and that's part of the art and the combination of art and science of guitar making.
and you could call that the black art if there is something, but it's every individual, and that's something. I haven't got it right. I have to guess with everybody that comes through the door. Jesus, okay, how is he playing? What's he doing? And you actually, every single one of my customers has become a friend.
Can we just let's talk about the Australian journey here. We talk about going into the Black Forest for 10 years and crawling back out again. We're on the other side of the world.
We may as well be on
and
the yeah.
There is no Australian qualification. There is nothing set up in Australia to qualify you as a luthier.
Yep.
Whereas Europe, it is
a respected trade.
It is a respected trade, and the US has built it up to be a respected trade. But in Australia, it's still a cottage industry, which is walked over. And unless you go over to the other side of the world and take that financial risk and do a qualification, you're not going to get a qualification. You literally have to build it up from what you've got and the information that you can get hold of. I spoke to one of the cello makers here in Australia recently who went through the Newark College, and I asked him, like, is it viable for me to go and get a qualification and go to the UK for 4 years and become a maker? And he said, it's actually not. He said, it's like any school. They push you through the fundamentals, but you're going to learn more about stuff, the more stuff that comes on your workbench. And I just took that as the fact that it's actually not feasible to get a qualification. And I mean, I'm not a big fan of the university system at the moment anyway, but the more stuff that comes on my workbench and the more diverse work that comes through, the more I learn about stuff. And there's an endless supply of support people that I can call and say, have you ever worked on this? Tell me what you did. You know, and it is actually a really great community here in Canberra, because you can actually get on the phone to the other guys and say, and even
and that's where me is the hermit.
Yeah, I mean,
I've just sort of shied away from that.
I mean, I've worked on
meet anybody. You know?
I've worked on French parlor guitars from the early 1800s, and I've just literally gotten on emails to people in France and saying, how did you do X, Y, and Z? And they have graciously come back and said, this is how you do it, you know. By the way, how are things on the other side of the world? It's a wonderful industry to be part of when you don't have the elitists. And I'll be honest with you, to me they're few and far between these days. In the 90s, like you,
80s and 90s,
there were so many people that would just protectively hoard away their knowledge because they didn't want anyone to know the secrets, you know. And like you say,
that was my experience, because that's when I was doing it.
It was horrible, and trying to get information was hard. It was really, really hard, and the internet just blew everything out of the water. And all of a sudden, it's like, well, you know, jump on YouTube and you can find out anything. Doesn't mean you can do it, but find out. You know, the number of people that I know who, you know, look at doing fret dressing on the internet and go, oh, yeah, I don't need to pay for that, and then they come to me and say, oh, I've screwed it up. So yeah, you sure did. And then they want a discount. So,
$25.
It's just a 5-minute job for you.
I think the theme is here, part of what we hope we're doing with the Expo too, is just to elevate knowledge about the instruments, apart from just enjoying listening to them, but just what goes into the making of them, and that was part of the reason for this little workshop. I'm conscious of the time, and I just wanted to sort of finish off with, and perhaps it's a good segue there, that this last little instrument on the stage, just mention a little bit about this and the person who made it, who's a very lovely gentleman called Brian DeGrucci. And he probably went through this exact journey, I think, starting in the 70s, starting to make guitars. He was born in 1949, so as a teenager he was listening to the hillbilly music and stuff like that, the tail end of that in the 50s in his Western Australia, in a little country town somewhere. Moved to Portland, Victoria, where he, in the early 70s, in that sort of back to the land, you know, self-sufficiency sort of era there, which I can remember as at that time, he decided to try and start making instruments. But he was very successful in the end. And so much so that the Tamworth Country Music Festival for many years have had DeGrucci sessions where people, the Casey Chambers, the Troy Cassadales, the Bill Chambers, and people who bought his instruments get together and talk about them and play them, which is a lovely thing. So I met Brian in the early 1980s when he moved to the Adelaide Hills, and I was living in Adelaide Hills at the time as well. And I'm coming out from the other side here, where I wasn't a maker but I was a client, and I wanted to get a guitar. And I went to see him. I'd heard about him. He'd made a few guitars at that stage. He went on to make 600 in his lifetime, and he passed away about 5 years ago. So, and in that time, he was concentrating on traditional steel string acoustic guitars, pretty much modelled on the Martin concept from America. Those of you who know steel string acoustic guitars, nice woods, traditional X bracing underneath the top in the structure of the guitar. And when I remember going to see Brian and saying, look, you know, I'd really like this kind of guitar, maybe a cutaway and a pickup and things like that. He's going, no, you don't want any of that. You just want a really good sounding acoustic guitar with the traditional features. And long story short, I bought this guitar, which is a small-bodied, it's modelled around a Martin O21 pre-war guitar, finger-style guitar. The neck joins the body at the 12th fret rather than the 14th, which is a bit more common these days. And this is the sort of guitar that was being played, the style of it, in the period of the 1930s into the 1940s, and still stands up as a great design. The nicest thing about it for me is that that emotional, sentimental, the word we were trying to find for more the art of the guitar. If you have a guitar for many years, and I've had this one for, well, it'll be 40 years next year now, and it's been a songwriting guitar. It's been, you know, part of my life for a long time. And when you have a relationship with an instrument like that for a long time, as a player, it's a special thing. And it stood up well, it plays well, and it's a nice guitar. So I've got somebody, if somebody can, perhaps if you can grab it, there's a little book there, Spiral Pound. There's some documents about Tex Morton, hand them around, but there's a book about Brian, which was put together by a friend of ours in South Australia, so feel free to pass that round and have a look. And I'll just play a little bit on this just to demonstrate the guitar. And I mean, as an acoustic guitar player, the other thing I think is the personal side of it. I'm not a big person, not a tall, large person, so I like having small-bodied guitars, and this guitar suits me really, really well. And it just has a nice tone. So. Just a simple C, F and G song to me sounds nice on this guitar, and it's prompted me to learn fingerstyle playing, which is a very rewarding way of playing a guitar. So I am conscious of the time, but we might have a little quick chat about this guitar, and then we'll see where it goes.
I'll add a postscript as well after you're done.
Oh, sure, no, that's fine.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Again, I'm going to talk about the Australian story and progress.
Yes.
Just for a minute, but we've come from nothing, literally in Australia as far as instrument making goes. since the 70s, and predominantly in the classical world, we have what is now recognised internationally as the Australian style, which has been developed by Greg Smallman and championed by people like Jim Redgate in Adelaide, and it has grown to become something that is completely uniquely Australian and so respected internationally. And it's interesting to think that, you know, the journey probably really started post Second World War from nothing, and, you know, in the space of 100 years we've gone to a style that matches the traditional European style and betters it in some people's eyes. And I think that's a wonderful way for Australian guitar making and Australian lutherie to have gone.
Yeah. And people like Michael and Tom are demonstrating that here in Canberra too, that journey continues, to use the word journey, for that development, that evolution, the love of the craft, the love of the science, and the attention to detail to make these kind of instruments. And something like in this case, that's, you know, a guitar that's been a part of my life for, you know, 4 decades. That's a wonderful thing. Yeah.
And as a builder, for me, there's nothing more special than seeing an owner get that sort of pleasure from something that's where we get our kicks, or I do. That's how I get my kicks. I've done the bouncing around in the 80s as a bad bass player on stage, you know, long hair, bad pants, and I still had my hair. And then I realised I was rubbish. So,
I think you're probably a bit hard on yourself a few
no,
times.
I was rubbish. But, and sometimes being able to do things, be it repair or, you know, like, I just do, it seems to be my life, fixing stuff, you know. And sometimes it gets frustrating, but as you get older, I sort of like, comfortable with, well, that was my lot in life, this is what I do. So, yeah, I'm not an astrophysicist or something, you know, but...
Neither am I.
Yeah, but Brian is.
And Mike, where do you see yourself going with your guitar making over the next, say, decade or so, ideally?
Ideally, my love is nylon strings, so classicals and flamencos. I also, predominantly my work is orchestral instruments these days. My new challenge is perfecting a violin. I don't have the space for cellos as far as building goes, but I do get the majority of my work is cello repairs. They are the best instrument in the world, so I'm always happy to hear the customer play them at the end of the day. Electrics, I'm a little bit over it. The older I get, the quieter I want to be. The loudest thing in my workshop is the phone. I do not have CNCs. I do have a router, I do have a bandsaw, but I work, the majority of my work is hand tools. It's also my gym sesh. Like Tom, I can belt through a guitar top by hand quicker than somebody can run up through a drum sander. I don't need to sit there and set equipment up. I'm not a timber machinist. I'm a craftsman. Yeah. There's a massive difference. Yeah. Yep.
I was just wondering, how does making and designing little aeroplanes correlate and help with making instruments?
Because they're fiddly. They're very, very finicky. When you're cutting out the struts for a wing, you've got to be really, really accurate. It's the same with carving the noses. I always found with model aeroplanes, if you're carving a nose out of a block, you do have to make sure that it's absolutely spot on, or else you get imbalance in your plane.
It's like anything. You just, I think, you just have to be. There's something that happens between your hands, your eyes, and your brain. I think it's that wiring between everything. That's where you develop those manual skills. And I always like it. When I was a kid, you know, you saw a plant and being able to turn that 2D image. And you reverse engineer things. This is how it This is how it's actually built. This is how it's made. And I look at that, and I don't see the guitar. I see how he's done it. And as I look at various other bits, and it's a curse. I look at something and go, that's how it was made. That's how the process. Then you learn things about everything. Even the chair you're sitting on. Think about how that was made. Who actually made it? It didn't just suddenly appear in the shop. And that's part of the whole problem that I highlight about society as a whole now. We're so used to just things coming out of China, and we've lost all those skills. And we just take it for granted until, COVID came along and all of a sudden, no, you can't get this, you can't get that, because at the end of the day, someone has to make it all. Even if it comes out of a machine, who made the machine that made it? Or the engineer that designed the stuff. It's just, you start breaking things down. And back to the model aeroplanes, you start with a plan, and you buy your balsa wood, and then you've got to cut it, you've got to sand it, and then, how am I going to finish it? How am I going to paint it? You learn about paints and finishes. Paints, finishes.
You get good at knife work.
Yeah. Sandpaper, planing, and just transforming that stuff in your head from 2D or to image, just how it goes into your head. And I wish I'd thought about this harder when my boys were little, to keep pounding them for the manual skills, because it'll be in them. Because I often thought, well, where did I get it from? Or did I get it? Or is it just something you're conditioned or learn? I don't know.
But the other thing as well is those skills and the traditional craft, that can be lost in as little as a generation.
Yes. Absolutely.
People need to keep learning traditional skills, because they will disappear like that, and you'll never pick it up again. It's like ancient language, it will go as soon as somebody turns the light off.
I think it's with music too, with playing the instruments, not only the building or any manual skill. There's so much that is transmitted person to person, which you can't quite put your finger on. It's an attitude, it's a feeling, it's an emotional quality to learning something from a person, which is different from reading about it, on a screen. And there have been some significant changes there. And I think as a society, we need to be aware of the strengths and weaknesses of these
These days, everybody learns from YouTube.
Yeah.
How do you do so? I have to look it up on YouTube. Yeah. And sometimes you can see some little slivers of gold in amongst it, but most of it's rubbish too.
Yeah. So I do encourage you, if you're a player or somebody who's interested in using your hands, to seek out other people to learn from. It's a much different journey, and it's a much deeper journey. And I think both Tom and Michael have expressed in different ways how that's affected them as makers, and it certainly affects us as players, because every time you sit down with another musician, whatever the instrument is, electric, acoustic, bass, if you're feeling something from that other person and learning from them, you'll learn it in a deeper way than watching it. Well, YouTube can be good up to a point, but I'm absolutely convinced there's something special about the human interaction. And actually that's also part of having a weekend like this, because all the conversations and the knowledge and emotion of Richie, for example, he lived very modestly. He made his guitars in basically a shed in his garden, but he did make a living out of it for the second half of his life, and his guitars had a quality similar to what I'm hearing from you guys, in that the sense that the people who own them really value them. And they've got a life out there now too.
And I think most of the guys have got, much like I've got a few patrons that basically whatever I build, they'll buy. And if they don't, somebody else will.
I think that's a great place to draw it to a close, because we're running a bit over time. But thank you so much, everyone, for coming in and kind of sharing this kind of one-off gathering of discussion and so on. And don't rush away.